the 2-hour figure you used. My recollection is the first tower was hit sometime around 8:46, I think.
Sorry, I said the first hijacking commenced at 8:14.
Oh, the first hijacking, I beg your pardon.
You're right, though, about an hour and a half after the first plane.
Okay, I think the way to respond to this, Senator, is as follows. Under the way the national security arrangement is and was, I should say was, the responsibility of the Department of Defense was essentially to defend our country from external threats. Indeed, the responsibility for internal threats, which is obviously what was taking place on September 11th, not an external threat, it was from within the country, was the responsibility of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and in the case of a hijacked aircraft, the Federal Aviation Administration. And the responsibility of the Department of Defense was as a supporter of an attack on our country in the event we were asked. But the Congress and the country has for many decades kept the Department of Defense out of the law enforcement business, out of the crime business, out of internal law enforcement issues under the Posse Comitatus Act. So the Department of Defense was oriented externally. Our radars were pointing out, not in, and the FAA was the one that then had the responsibility to say there's a hijack, and then ask the Department of Defense, say, will you track and report on that hijacking? The hijacking traditionally being a situation where a plane is taken for the purpose of going someplace and then getting some political advantage for it, not flying it into a building. So the way you characterize the chain of command is correct, from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commander, but it applied to things from external threats, not the responsibility of the FBI or the FAA.
I respect, sir, that the circumstances that morning were very different from what anybody had foreseen. Given, however, that the Vice President at that point from the command control bunker of the White House is communicating, again, I'm using the 9/11 Commission reports information here, is communicating via military aid to NORAD the President's verbal authority to shoot down a plane, and that information is not, that instruction is not communicated then to the fighter pilots circling the United States Capitol and the New York City. Is that the way it's supposed to function? Or would that happen again if we were to be surprised again today?
I'm going to have General Myers to add to this, but the answer is of course not. Since that day, a great many adjustments and changes have been made, and we have various types of fighter aircraft on alert. We have established a Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security in the Department of Defense. We have established a Northern Command that never existed for the Department of Defense to be addressing the Homeland Security issues from a Defense Department standpoint. We have a new Department of Homeland Security that exists. There are just a dozen things that are different. The way to stop airplanes is clearly from the ground. That is to say, to have air marshals and to have reinforced doors and to have baggage inspections and to not allow terrorists on aircraft that they can then take that aircraft and fly it into a building. Now, as a last resort, is it possible that we could shoot down an aircraft in the event that was necessary? Yes, it's possible. Airplanes fly right past the Pentagon every 5 minutes. And what it takes is simply to lower your nose and go into something. Could we stop that? No. I mean, the fact of the matter is that with all the airplanes flying around in the skies, it is not possible to do it in many instances. We do spend a lot of money and a lot of effort to try to stop it, both from the ground and from the air. And so the answer to your question is yes, a great deal has changed.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. If I may
Myers, I
just ask the...
Let's have General Myers.
Yes, sir.
reply.
May I ask him also? All right, yes, sir.
Go ahead, Senator.
Senator Dayton, I would just add to the Secretary's remarks that now that NORAD is focused inward as well as externally, that there are rules of engagement that have been promulgated that are well understood in a classified session or outside this room. We could talk about that if you want to, but they're very well understood up and down the chain of command, and it's practiced all the time. And clearly we're talking about some very serious issues here, as the Secretary said. It also involves ground defenses, not just air defenses. But the rules of engagement, the command and control structure that's set in there is completely different because the mission for NORAD changed after 9/11, and no longer were they asked to look just externally but also internally. And the relationship between NORAD and the Federal Aviation Administration has also changed dramatically, and we've worked those arrangements where we have, I think, very good communications today. And I talked to General Eberhart today about that particular issue, and he certainly agrees.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just ask respond also, Mr. Chairman, if you would, in writing to the, I think it's inference, but it's also really an explicit accusation made in the substance of the report on particularly page 34, that NORAD's testimony 20 months after 9/11 to the 9/11 Commission about the sequence of events, particularly the failure of the FAA to inform NORAD on a timely basis of 3 of the 4 hijackings, was inaccurate. The statement made by NORAD publicly 1 week after 9/11, which is very similar to that testimony made 20 months later, was also inaccurate, seriously misleading anybody trying to assess the response and non-response that day in a way that I think is far more alarming about FAA's failure, proper response than NORAD's. But if you would please review that testimony and see, because I don't believe anybody has held those discrepancies, anyone to account for those discrepancies, and I consider them to be more than just oversights. I think they're serious misrepresentations of the facts. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Can I make just a comment on that, Senator Dayton? I'll liken this to an accident investigation board when an aircraft crashes. I've been reviewing officials or at the table at many of those. And normally what happens when an incident happens, there is the first report, which has some accuracies and many inaccuracies. And so statements, what people believe happened immediately afterwards and in the next week or 2 weeks, is what they believe. But as they continue to harvest the facts, and as we go to machines that record things like aircraft recorders, like radar scope recorders and so forth, you know, the facts become clearer, and what people thought they saw or thought they understood or thought they heard changes over time. And that's the nature of these kind of investigations. I think NORAD would be the first to say that because of the access that the 9/11 Commission had to certain parts of this apparatus that was collecting this data, that it sharpened their focus too, and things they thought happened turned out to be either different or incomplete. And it took a lot of work and a lot of months to come to, you know, what was ground truth. The same thing is true in accident investigations. It takes us sometimes many months to come to ground truth, and what people thought they heard, what they thought they saw, will be changed as they review the facts. And I think that's the case. I've talked to General Eberhart about this. I do not know what the motivation of NORAD would be to ever lie or deceive. I mean, that's not what they're pledged to do. They're pledged to do the same thing we all are in uniform, and that's defend this country. And I would take exception to anybody thinks that they had any other motive.
Thank you very much, General.
I just say, Mr. Chairman, this 20 months after this sworn testimony to the Commission, 20 months after the event, I think is worthy of your scrutiny, please. And furthermore, because, and I bring this up not just for historical reasons, 2 months ago, and if you have a chance to review the circumstances with the plane that caused the evacuation of the Capitol complex, with thousands of people running for their lives here, being informed to do so by the Capitol Police because of, again, a failure of the FAA, and almost entirely, based on the evidence I have, their failure to communicate just basic information to air defense, to anyone else, including the Capitol Police, that we had a situation there, the closest simulation I think we could possibly have, because people thought it was a real threat until they found out otherwise, that we could have, and here 2.5 years after 9/11 has occurred, we find basically, again, a complete breakdown of communication by the federal authorities, and again, primarily FAA, but to National Defense Command and to others, so that we don't have a response. And, you know, we talk about things not changing as a result of 9/11. This, to me, is the most horrific example that I could imagine, and if we don't deal with the fact that we failed now a second time on the basic elements of communication and following
Senator,
protocols
I have
and
to
procedures.
thank you
No,
for
sir,
that.
I've waited, sir, for 3 and 4 hours here.
Yeah, but
I just
we're going
finish.
to cut out the time of other senators to be able to ask
That's right.
a
Yes,
single
as
question.
I have waited a long time,
I
sir.
ask your indulgence to
Or-
supply it for the record, please, so that I can turn
Before
to...
9/11 happens again, I was asked that we
You take
review
care
that
of your-
evidence. Thank you.
Senator Dayton, if I'll respond to that for the record, if I may, Mr. Chairman. and
I'm going to
Senator,
have
if that's-
to ask respectfully that you provide, this is an important colloquy, but I've had senators waiting just as long. Senator Cornyn, it is your time. Please reply for the record, General.